Greetings and welcome to this United Nations Association webinar on the topic Sustainable Development Goals as a Tool for the Post-COVID-19 Economy. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai ki te rōpū whakakotahi whenua o Aotearoa. Ko Peter Nichols toko ingoa. I extend a very warm welcome to this webinar, which, despite COVID, is ironically the largest meeting of UNANs in my time as president. I especially welcome visitors from overseas, and we might add facetiously, despite the travel restrictions. This also reinforces a theme of global connectiveness and collective effort to meet shared challenges, albeit via technology at the moment. The goal of the United Nations Association of New Zealand is to promote engagement with the UN. This webinar continues the pursuit of that goal. We warmly welcome new members to the association with our 6 branches nationwide. If you would like to join, then please visit our UNANZ website. 5 years ago, United Nations member states endorsed the ambitious 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. There are 17 objectives for securing human and planet prosperity for now and into the future. The COVID-19 pandemic, which presented in the first quarter of this year, and the associated economic crisis are posing huge challenges around the globe. This webinar will explore how the SDGs can be used to face those challenges which arise from the pandemic. I will now invite Wadji Haneti, our Special Officer for Sustainable Economy and Innovations, to introduce our 4 distinguished speakers and to chair the evening. Wadji.
Thank you very much, Peter, for open discussion and welcoming us. Welcome, everyone. I am very much honored and excited to moderate this highly inspirational panel. As with our role, the United Nations Association of New Zealand decided to come forward to discuss how 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals provide a platform of sensitive responsiveness to post-COVID-19 socio-economic rebuilding better, delivering actions to achieve sustainable development for current and future generations. As we all understand, this is a critical moment of urgent decision-making, accelerating the actions to secure people's health and well-being and rebuilding the economy, which will have impacts on our future. However, these immediate retention strategies for economic recovery will require to understand what we need to maintain, spend, and scale up, and realistic short and medium-term response measures. Combating this crisis is a collaborative and collective work. Today, together with our panelists, you in the audience, we all have a new opportunity to rethink jointly, supporting, recovering better in a transformative pathway. We are honored to have a panel of speakers to educate us more on the topic, how Sustainable Development Goals provide a synergetic effect on post-COVID socio-economic recovery, bringing their rich knowledge and experience in economic governance, policy guidance, circular economy, resource efficiency and sustainable consumption and production, natural resource management, climate change, and regional integration, investments, and trading. The audience is very much welcome to forward your questions and share your ideas. You can use Q&A box to communicate with speakers. Kindly mention where you are from, your institution with your questions. Shall we meet our speakers tonight? Firstly, I would like to welcome Professor Girol Karacaoglu. Professor Karacaoglu is the head of the School of Government, Victoria University of Wellington. He joined Victoria University from the New Zealand Treasury where he was the chief economist. Before then, he was the chief executive of the Cooperative Bank of New Zealand for 9 years. His previous roles included General Manager at Westpac New Zealand, Chief Economist at the National Bank of New Zealand, and lecturer in economics at Victoria University. His research interest is in public policy and integrated approach to economic, environmental, and social policies towards improving intergenerational well-being. He is a co-author of the book Intergenerational Well-being and Public Policy. He will speak about the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals and reshaping the economic governance with the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Professor Girol. We then have Ned Clarence-Smith. Mr. Clarence-Smith recently retired from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, where he had worked for 18 years. In his last positions, he was the representative and director of UNIDO's regional offices in Thailand and China. Before this, he worked at UNIDO's headquarters in the Regional Cleaner Production Program and as the organization's senior coordinator for the Global Environment Facilities. He has supported governments, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs to develop both management and policy solutions to improve sustainability practices in industries. Also, prior to the UNIDO, he worked for DEM and Moore International Italy as the CEO, Natural Resources Defense Council in New York, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Italy, and the US Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. In recent years, he has turned his attention to circular economies and the role of industry in such economies, offering training and technical assistance services. He teaches a graduate intensive course at Kyoto University on sustainable industrialization. Welcome, Ned, to speak. Importance of strengthening sustainable consumption and production strategies to build a material efficient society. I would also like to welcome Dr. Mia Mikik. Dr. Mikik is the Director of the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division for the United Nations Economics and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, as well as the Chief of Trade Policy. She is the coordinator of the Asia Pacific Research and Trading Network on Trade. Mia guides and supervises the analytical on trade policy and trade-related areas, and all research is geared towards creating applicable and adequate evidence to improve trade, investment, and policy making. Previously, Dr. Mikik was the professor of international economics and director of the Economics and Business International program of the University of Zagreb. For 16 years, Mia worked as a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland School of Business. She will talk about reshaping the regional integration, investment, and trading to support sustainable development. Lastly, we have welcome Mia. And lastly, Dr. Stefanos Posio to speak Getting Back Better, Protecting Biodiversity and Supporting Climate Action through Economic Stimulus. Dr. Posio is the Director of Environment and Development at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. He works on resource efficiency, urban development, natural resources management, and climate change. Previously, he worked for the United Nations Environment Program in France as head of Cities and Lifestyles Unit, planning, coordinating, and managing UNEP's work on sustainable cities, green building, responsible consumption, and sustainable lifestyles. He also served as Senior Regional Coordinator for UNEP. Welcome, Stefanos. Hereby, I pass the screen to our speakers. Professor Girol, to you at first.
Thank you, Peter and Waji, for your introductory comments. Hello, everyone, and thank you, UNANS, for organizing this conversation. First, I want to check that you're all hearing me. Is that all right? Okay, thank you. The theme of this conversation is how do we use the opportunities created by the very sad COVID-19 event to create a better world and think of public policy in a different way. My contribution is to explore the key features of an integrated governance of the natural environment, society, and economy as a platform for achieving sustainable well-being across generations. The topic has been framed as rewriting the economic narrative for sustainable well-being. I suggest that rather we should talk about an integrated environmental, social, and economic narrative and not just focus on reframing the economic conversation. We are familiar with these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I will not dwell on those. What I'll do instead is to say, in anticipation of the way I'll approach the governance issue, and I'm talking about system level governance, I want to suggest that in fact, those 17 Sustainable Development Goals can be very usefully organized around three clusters. One is the biosphere or the natural environment. The other is society, and the third is the economy. Of course, social and individual lives are lived in a natural environment surrounded by it. Society itself lives within it, and the economy is very much part of the social infrastructure. So before I talk about how governance is affected by this conceptualization, I want to pose a prior question. We keep talking about sustainability. The question is, what are we talking about? Sustainability of what? This particular slide is beautifully framed to suggest that what we're really talking about is sustainability of well-being. In other words, protecting and enhancing the kinds of lives we want to live as individuals and communities. And to that end, of course, natural capital, built capital, human capital, social capital interact in various ways in order to give us the kind of lives we want to live. And the role of public policy is to maintain and enhance it by making sure that these various ecosystems are managed in appropriate ways. So that, I suggest, is the way to think appropriately about sustainability. And all the Sustainable Development Goals naturally can be organized around these ecosystems, as I explained earlier. In that context, the question arises, why all of a sudden are we talking about the relationship of this with COVID-19? I suggest two entry points. Of course, there will be several others. One is that although the picture I painted is old hat, what happened is COVID-19 all of a sudden provided a catalyst for a different conversation about public policy. And if you're a social constructivist, you know, or you believe that if you want to make major change in public policy, you have to change the public conversation first, the national conversation, the discourse. And COVID-19 has been a catalyst for this change around the world. Everybody is now talking about using this catastrophe as an opportunity to rethink about the way we live and we do public policy. The second entry point is that in some cases, COVID-19 has also served as a catalyst for the convergence of henceforth divergent interests. I give an example from a very small community within our country in New Zealand, which is Queenstown, the livelihood of which depended strongly on tourism. And although the community had grave concerns about the growth of tourism on the social infrastructure and on the natural environment, the business community, which dominated council decisions, kept investing in infrastructure to accommodate yet more tourism. But what happened after COVID-19, all of a sudden, for a while, international tourism at least is very slow or dead for 2-3 years. Those same interests are now talking to the wider community about reimagining Queenstown as a place possibly without tourism. Can it be an incubator of ideas for the world at large? Can it be a home for a world-class university, and so on and so forth? So that's what I mean by convergence of interests. If we're talking about system level of governance for sustainable well-being, with the goals being ingredients of that, what are the key outputs that that governance structure need to deliver? First of all, it needs to deliver a long-term focus in policy making as a complement to the short-term management we need to do. Of course, we need to manage our society, environment, and economy. But alongside that, we need a long-term focus in policy making if we are genuine about sustainability. Secondly, it needs to deliver an inclusive decision-making mechanism which aggregates the wisdom, expertise, and experiences of all stakeholders living in communities and society. Third, it needs to enable and encourage an integrated environmental, social, and economic approach to public policy. Fourth, it needs to have a suitable supporting funding infrastructure, long-term investment infrastructure, in order to fund these long-term investments. And finally, it should accommodate changing preferences as new generations come to Earth and live their lives, so that it can be flexible, as we call it in economics, time consistent. Those are the key outputs that we require of a good governance system that underpins sustainable development and sustainable well-being. What would be the mechanisms that would deliver these outputs? I'll go through these quickly. I don't want you to bore you to death, but the detail is in the slides. The first thing is that it needs to separate the short-term 3-year management role in New Zealand, this 3 years of government, from the long-term stewardship role of Parliament. Secondly, Parliament specifies intergenerational well-being as the core objective of public policy and holds each government accountable for putting in place policies that promote it. Third, Parliament sets the long-term environmental, social, and economic objectives and associated targets. It does that under advice from an independent Office for Well-being, which reports to Parliament. We have the equivalent of that as the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. That IOW is directly accountable to Parliament as the steward of generations to come, not only for the current government. Fifth, it generates machinery to consult with and work collaboratively with local and regional councils, NGOs, and so on. It is informed by the input from a What Works Wellbeing network, which mirrors what happens in the UK. In other words, this is an institution that brings the wisdom and know-how of NGOs, local regional government representatives, academics, and so on, to inform, evidence-based, inform the kinds of policies that will promote well-being, what works, what does not work. I am not hallucinating. This actually is the case in the UK right now. The governance machinery sitting on top of that is a multi-party parliamentary governance group. This is about thinking generations, not only day to day. The distinctive role of IOW is to monitor and report on behalf of Parliament the progress that's being made. Parliament legislates that the government will set short-term targets towards achieving these long-term objectives. It cares not only about what's happening to particular groups or averages, but distribution across society, ethnicity, gender, as well as generations. A dedicated investment manager is appointed for each key outcome, and it manages the investments associated with that outcome. And a community-based manager and budget holder works with the center whenever we delegate social and environmental initiatives to the local regional government so that they are accountable for what they do. So that would be the broad picture of the machinery that's required. The funding, there are many ways of funding, but I believe that the correct way of funding, an equitable and efficient way of funding such long-term investments, is through a save-as-you-go kind of machinery where you have an investment fund into which government invests, and that's a long-term investment fund, such as our New Zealand Superannuation Fund, call it the New Zealand Wellbeing Fund. Those investments, the returns on which are used to fund these kinds of investments. We already have in New Zealand an investment manager called the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission. All we need to do is to tell these good people that infrastructure includes environment, society, and economy, and their burden is to make sure that they manage the overall investment portfolio to serve these purposes in an integrated way. Since we are living in an uncertain world and we are talking across generations, the main focus of these investments will be building resilience to unknown unknowns, as it were, just like we saw with the pandemic, although a lot of people were already predicting a possible pandemic. Nevertheless, the fundamental point is the focus of the investment strategy needs to be building resilience, which has two legs. One is survival, in other words, shock absorbing capacity. The other is thriving, in other words, flourishing. So you need to create an environment where to unknown unknowns we can respond, first by surviving, second by using our collective imagination to create a different world, which is what we are trying to do with these conversations. And finally, if I were a dictator and I were in charge of the world and I wanted to promote intergenerational well-being, what would be the four legs of my long-term investment strategy? What would I be advising the IOW and the parliamentary commissioner? First of all, I would say we need to follow a leave no one behind strategy delivered by ensuring income, housing, health services, and education for everyone. This is a critical platform for both surviving and thriving. Secondly, I would focus on creating sustained employment through our long-term projects where the government provides the ecosystem and the private sector comes like flies to make money out of it. There's nothing wrong with making money provided you're making money from activities that serve the broader public good. So the fundamental focus would be sustained employment creation through appropriate investments. Third, I would invest in human capital in order to create the skill base for productive employment in such environment-friendly industries. And finally, I would gear my education system that builds a long-term national support by the business community, schools, as well as a community at large to support this kind of strategy, because the narrative is very important. If you get the whole public behind you and you show them that by doing this, everybody wins, then I think we have a fantastic governance platform for sustainable well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Shall we listen to Ned?
Morning, everyone. I seem to have started at the end. Let me quickly go to the very beginning. So what I want to do with you today is I want to talk about the importance of strengthening sustainable consumption production strategies to enable a material efficient society. But I want to see this through the lens of circular economy. Let me start first by making the connection between the SDGs and material efficiency. For those of you who have read the SDGs carefully, you'll see that material efficiency is threaded through the SDGs, appearing in a number of the targets. In the SDG on water, for instance, there is also efficiency mentioned in the SDG on number 7 on energy. Remember that energy efficiency is really, I would say, a subset of material efficiency, since we have to get, we need materials to get our energy. Then, of course, we have it also in SDG 8 on economic development, SDG 9 on industrial development, and then also in SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. So, as I say, we have material efficiency, efficiency in general, threaded through the SDGs. Why is there this stress on material efficiency in the SDGs? Well, I think this graph here gives you the answer. This is showing the relationship between GDP per capita on the x-axis and metabolic rate, which is really a measure of resource consumption, tons per capita per year, on the y-axis. And as you can see, there is actually a very strong correlation between the two. So essentially, resource consumption is closely tracking GDP growth. The more GDP we have, the more resource consumption we have, at least in the economic models that we have today. So what is the problem that that creates for us? I mean, wealth creation is a good thing. It's increased the well-being of billions of us around the planet ever since the Industrial Revolution. And we have to remember that there are billions more who are waiting to be lifted out of poverty. We mustn't leave anyone behind, as Girol said. The problem is that the model of wealth creation that we use now is creating us a series of environmental problems which have come to the point of verging on the disastrous. The fact is that globally our use of resources is now so enormous that we are beginning to destroy the Earth's ecosystems. Climate change is the obvious example, but there are many other serious impacts that are going on our ecosystems, which are related to our use of resources, our consumption of resources. And really, unless we very fundamentally change the way we do things, all our efforts to raise the billions who are still in poverty out of that poverty will just make things worse in terms of our relations to the ecosystems. The answer is that we need to, in the jargon, we need to decouple. And coming back to what Girol says, what we want is we want to have continued growth in well-being, but we don't want to have resource use grow as much as that growth in human well-being. And of course, economic activity is a good part of human well-being, but it's not the whole picture. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we decouple the amount of resources that we use, the growth in the resources. We want to decouple that from economic activity, but also primarily from human well-being. And in fact, what we really want is we want to decouple the impacts that our use of resources and our economic activity in general is having on the environment. And in fact, I want to point out that this idea of a need for decoupling is something that you find in the SDGs. It's buried a little, I have to say, but in the 4th target of SDG 8, you'll see the phrase, endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. Well, now, the initial response of governments to this need for decoupling was to promote energy and material efficiency in the sense of trying to reduce the amount of inputs for a given unit of material output. Now, governments on the energy efficiency side, governments have actually been pushing that since the first oil crisis back in '73 when I was a young lad. Material efficiency has been later on the picture of governments since probably the 1990s. And to do this, many governments have over the years established programs that on the productive side support companies to become more material and energy efficient. For instance, over here, we have a report from the German Agency for Material Efficiency. The international community has also been active. For instance, when I was working at UNIDO, I was working in the Cleaner Production Program. It's a joint program with UNEP, which has been going on since 1994. And this, for instance, is one of the reports, a toolkit that we had prepared. Now, on the consumption side, many governments have also been introducing programs to make products, especially more energy efficiency. That has been a very big focus, but also in more recent years to see that they use less water, less detergents, and so on. And I'm sure many of you are aware, have seen these kind of energy labels that we see on products. That is a result of government policies. So in a way, the SDG, the stress on material and energy efficiency in the SDGs is merely a reflection of an efforts that was being made by governments and have been made by governments over a number of decades. But the fact of the matter is that efficiency, at least the way that we have been understanding efficiency, has not been enough. We have managed to slow down the rate of growth in material consumption, but not to stop growth completely, which I believe at the global level is now actually what we need to do. Within countries, some countries, especially the less developed countries, could still see growth in resource consumption, but at the global level, in my opinion, we need now to cap it. So this, shall we say, relative failure of efficiency, again, as we've understood it, leads us now to the idea of circular economies. And what is actually the problem with the economic model that we have now? The fact is that the flows of materials through those economies are generally linear. I mean, we extract resources, we use those resources to produce products, we distribute those products, we consume those products, and at the end, we then dispose them back into the environment. And the efficiency work that we've been doing up to now has been trying to make these arrows skinnier, but the fact is that the overall growth, which has been driven by economic growth, has simply overwhelmed our efforts to make those arrows skinnier. And so essentially, the idea is that we should be transitioning to circular economies where the materials that we use in our economies are recycled and reused over and over again. What that would do is it would really allow us to decouple material consumption from growth, in the sense that it would allow us to considerably reduce the amount of virgin resources that we need to extract from the environment and the amount of waste that will inevitably leak back into the environment. Now, I should point out here that circular economy is not just about recycling. Many people, when they think of circular economies, they think we're just talking about doing a lot more recycling. Yes, that is true. That is part of a circular economy, but actually there's much more to a circular economy than that. There are, I would say, 4 distinct strategies that are underpinning a circular economy. And I've given them these titles: narrowing flows, slowing flows down, intensifying the use of flows, and then closing the loops. And I'm just going to run through those one after another. In terms of narrowing flows, essentially what we're trying to do here is to have less materials circulating in the economy through efficiency improvements. And this is basically what we have been doing for the last 30 to 50 years. It's not finished. It's not a job done here. There's still a lot of potential for us to be more efficient in the way that we use our materials and energy. And this is especially true in the developing countries. This little figure on the right comes from McKinsey, where they did a study of the productivity opportunities. Productivity is, if you want, another way of talking about efficiency. Productivity improvements in various regions of the world. And as you can see from this little box down at the bottom here, the majority of the opportunities as they saw it are in the developing countries rather than the developed countries. What about the other strategies? So slowing flows down. Essentially, what we're trying to do here is to extend the useful life of products. If I can put it this way, what we want to do is want to have our products hang around longer in the economies and go on being used for a longer time. And I want to stress here that this is actually another form of efficiency. What you're doing here, instead of trying to have more product with more material product with less material inputs, what you're trying to do is you're trying to squeeze more use, the service of that product, out of that same product. And the net result of this would be that you would need less new products in your economy, and so less materials overall would be circulating in the economy. How can you do that? Well, there's a number of ways. I mean, companies, of course, they could design or redesign their products so that they last longer. And then there are various repair strategies. There's classic repair where, you know, I take something that is broken to the repair shop around the corner, or now a lot of that is migrating onto the internet. Or there are programs of preventive maintenance, which is, I would say, more or less routine now in industry, where companies are preventively maintaining their equipment, replacing parts that are worn so that the equipment doesn't break down at a future point. And then there is what's called remanufacturing, which is where a product, once it's been used, is taken back to a factory. It is stripped down. Parts which are no longer working or are used or obsolete are taken out and replaced. And then the whole product is put back together again and is put back on the market as good as new, with a warranty to that effect. And there are various types of things going on which are similar to remanufacturing, refurbishing, reconditioning. Essentially, they're all more or less about the same thing. And then the final way of extending product lifetimes is, of course, second-hand markets. When I no longer need or want a product, I can hand it on to someone else, either for free or after payment, so that it can have a new life with someone else. How about the third strategy, which is intensifying the use of flows? This is actually another form of efficiency where we're trying to squeeze more use out of a product. But this time we do it by sharing products. Because the fact of the matter is that many of the products that we own are grossly underutilized. Take this example of a car here. This is on the basis of a study that the EU did. A car is made to move someone from A to B. That is the reason why cars are made. But in the EU anyway, a typical car is only driving 5% of the time. 1% of the time it's sitting in traffic jams. 1.6% of the time it's the car is driving around, or the driver is driving around looking for parking. And a whopping 92% of the time, a car is simply parked doing nothing. And that's a tremendous waste of all of the materials, all of the energy that went into making this product, which was meant to move you from A to B. 92% of the time, it's not doing that. And there are many, many examples of that around us. Now, there's two ways that we can increase sharing. One is what I call true sharing, which is where I own something and we use it together, or I lend it to you. And then there is what's often called product service economy, which is I own something and I lend out its services to you for a fee. True sharing, let's talk about that for a minute. It's always existed, right? But traditionally, you only share with people that you know and you trust, with your family, with your friends. But normally you would never share with someone who is a stranger. But now, with the internet, we have online sharing economy. And what that's done is, that has created mechanisms which allow you to share with someone you don't know, but you feel you can trust. And so potentially this massively increases the pool of people each of us will accept to share with, and therefore massively increases the positive environmental sharing. Carpooling is a modern example of true sharing. So we have this little diagram here. Instead of 3 people individually using 3 cars to get to work, say, they pool together and they use only 1 car to get the 3 of them to work. That is a classic example of true sharing. What about product service economy? Again, this is something that has always existed. Staying with the car motif, taxis. Taxis is exactly that. I own a taxi, or I work for a company that owns a taxi, and I rent to you the service of getting you from A to B, and you pay me for that service. Again, internet has got into the picture here, and it's massively increased the supply of these kinds of services. And as we know, it has severely disrupted existing markets. So for instance, staying with taxis, the internet has now allowed different types of taxi services to spring up. We have car sharing schemes where you use the internet to find a car where it's parked closest to you. You use the internet to get into the car. The internet tracks how much you use the car, and the internet bills you for the time that you've paid. Basically, in that case, you are your own taxi driver. Or we have Uber and Uber-like schemes where people who own a car and have spare time can use that time to be essentially a part-time taxi driver. And here again, the whole system is based on the internet. You use the internet to link up with a taxi driver, an Uber driver, I should say. The Uber driver uses the internet to find out where you are, and the internet is used to bill you. And coming back to the trust issue, there is a mechanism there where you, but also the driver, can rate each other. Those are the three strategies, and then we come to the 4th. But before I come to this, I really want to stress that what we're talking about is a cleverer use of the concept of efficiency. As I say, before we were talking about focusing on having more product coming out of less material inputs. But now what we need to do is to focus on the service of products and be more efficient about that, getting more service with less material inputs. That's really what we're talking about. But now, anyway, closing up the 4 strategies, we have the last one, which is closing the loops, the one that many people think is actually what circular economy is about. And that is when you finally, the product really comes to the end of its life, when you've wrung out every last drop of use that you can of them. The materials that are locked up in those products is recycled and reused to make new products. And as I say, this should really be the last strategy applied to a product, when all of the others have been played out. Now, in terms of what has been going on, at least at the government level, in terms of promoting these 4 strategies. Have governments been promoting them? Yes and no. As we've seen, governments have been pushing energy and material efficiency for 40 years or more. They've also been pushing recycling for perhaps 30 years, at least in the developed countries. It still needs, that is still something that needs to be developed in the developing countries. As for the other strategies, it's only really quite recently that governments have been getting involved. Especially on the 2nd strategy, on extending product lifetimes. I mean, we've seen efforts by governments to encourage the design of products with longer lifetimes through green procurement programs or eco-label programs. There's been recently a spate of political activity around repair, trying to make repair an easier option for consumers to choose. There's also been some policies put out where, which are pushing for longer product lifetimes. Where government has essentially mandated that product warranties should be longer than they have been in the past. On the other hand, to my knowledge, governments have not really been terribly involved in efforts to promote second-hand markets. So that's an area that's still, shall we say, virgin from the policy point of view. And also on the 3rd strategy, governments have really done very little to promote a sharing economy intensify product use. In fact, I think we could say that governments are currently struggling to regulate, to control the shared economy rather than to promote it. So now, if a government wants to transition to a circular economy, or coming back to what Girol says, where we need to get all of the stakeholders involved, if the country as a whole has agreed that it wants to transition to a circular economy, how would you do that? Because transitioning to a circular economy implies really a very radical overhaul of the economy. It's not something that can happen because a government has a policy here and a policy there and does a little bit of this and does a little bit of that. No, to make a transition possible, we really need to have a strategic decision by government to make that transition. Then on the basis of that, there has to be the development of a whole of government plan to get there, because going over to a circular economy is going to involve every single department in government, because the whole of the economy is involved. And then we need an implementation of a plan across the whole of the government to get to that point. Now, for those interested, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is a foundation that is devoted to the cause of circular economies, has produced a report, over here I have it, entitled a Toolkit for Policymakers. It's basically a step-by-step manual for any country wishing to transition to a circular economy. But you could also study what the Netherlands is doing. The government there, a few years ago, committed to having a fully circular economy by the year 2050, and it's in the process of implementing that commitment. With that, I stop, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ned, for beautiful insights you have provided, along with Professor Girol's presentation, especially talking about the need of decoupling environmental degradation and economic development. Shall we turn to Mia Mikik to listen her presentation? Welcome, Mia.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Allow me to say Karacaoglu ko Mia Mikik tokuinga. Apologies, Peter, to you in particular, because obviously I'm not even a nano amount of fluent as you are.
That's very good. I appreciate your support.
But I wanted to try it, and I hope I will have other opportunities to do that, right? Thank you very much also for the invitation to this discussion. It is really my privilege to join the panel, and after listening to Professor Girol and you, Ned, I have to swap into a different topic, which is not so noble as you guys were talking, because it's more about, you know, making money, and in this context, right? It is, people don't necessarily always like to listen to that. But allow me to go through the presentation, and then hopefully we have some time for questions in the end as well. So in terms of sharing the presentation, I think I'm already there. Are you able to see the slides as they are, right? So I think I'm already on my slide, introductory slide. I just wanted to take everyone to basically the end of last year. And I'm sure many of you read The Economist, which puts out a double issue in the end of the year, and gives forecasts and estimates about what's going to happen in the year ahead. Then there are other magazines, etc. And so in December 2019, we had some negative news, but most of the news were quite positive, right? We were looking forward to resolution about Brexit. We were looking forward to China actually getting into you know, declaring itself not anymore a developing economy. We're looking about capitalism actually accepting and endorsing green things and assigning to the more sustainable production, and you know, the only dark spot on all of that was really continuing trade war that we had between US and China, and of course increasing inequality or persistent inequality, and of course climate change that was looming over all of that. But obviously the situation nowadays, after we have entered into 2020, is very different. And I will talk about the state of affairs in terms of trade and investment and business. But let me just also put a slide from SDG progress report that ESCA puts out regularly. And just to give you a very quick insight into where we were standing at the end of 2019, which is the vertical line across all the 17 SDGs. And if we were on the track with delivering all of each one of the goals by 2019, we would be approaching that vertical line. And you can see very obvious from the figure that in none of the goals we are close to the 2019 line. And actually in some of the goals, we are regressing and moving away from it, particularly in responsible consumption and production, and in terms of climate and sustainability of cities, etc. Obviously, this is the average for the whole of Asia Pacific. Individual countries look differently in different contexts, but this is a situation which across the world, Asia Pacific is not different from there, and that's why Secretary General was calling at the end of last year for the accelerated action towards making progress to sustainable development goals. So we were already in a sort of red alert situation in terms of delivery of sustainable development at the end of last year, when of course the COVID-19 hit, and all the actions that, or the measures that government put through in order to control the spread of COVID-19, became known as the Great Lockdown, because most of them were dealing with restricting people and cargo to move in absence of having vaccine, or in absence of having treatments, or even capacity in the health facilities to look after healthcare of people. So the measures that they were imposed on restricting mobility of people and productive capacity of firms had a very clear impact on these economic activities through supply and demand shocks, as we call them, right? When people don't go to work, obviously the production stops, and for time being, if you have everything else happening, the inventories are being put to use. But then once they're depleted, you have no more products to put to the market. So that's a supply shock. And this one was made even worse because of the restrictions on mobility in terms of transport and mobility within the country. And then once the people can't go to work, of course they don't earn income, and because of uncertainty, etc., they stop consumption. And that consumption happen at the consumer level with the households, but also what happens is the investment falls down, and so you have this demand shock. Now this happens within the economy, but then it is only enhanced when the transactions are linked and go across the border. So in terms of lots of activities that people are engaged in and crossing the borders in tourism and hospitality, education, even the medical tourism, etc. All of those movements have basically stopped, halted altogether, and created lots of economic losses for the countries that rely on particularly those sectors, right? And then of course, as I said, once the stocks that are produced are depleted and traded away, the trade itself stops for that reason. We will see later on that there are additional reasons why these particular channels of transmissions worked in this negative way to produce the following effects. So what we have in this figure is a longer term index or trend of export from Asia Pacific and FDI inflows into Asia Pacific, which is the this dashed line. And so you can see that the estimates or the forecasts for the 2020 are actually all looking south and indicating very sharp contraction of these activities. And so these are the forecasts. And then actually for the first 2 quarters of this year, UNCTAD has produced already the calculation of the drop in terms of merchandise trade. What also has happened is that, as I said, because people were stopped from traveling, the international tourism has simply fell through the floor. And these are not the actual numbers. These are just calculations based on what we or what the World Tourism Organization actually put in terms of various scenarios. But you can see that even we talk about in the worst case scenario about 80% drop of international tourist arrivals in countries. For Maldives or countries, even Thailand, that depend on actually international tourism for their economic prosperity, growth, income creation, etc. It is spelling big trouble. Another type of impact that we have to seriously look at is really what's happening with the business, what's happening with the firms. I think everyone knows that majority of firms consist of so-called micro or small and medium-sized enterprises. In some countries, up to 98% of businesses are in that category, and they definitely employ the most of the people. Now, the confidence of these businesses has simply disappeared because they stopped getting orders, and they don't really see where the next source of income will come through, because again, in this graph, what you have is pairing the trend in the global business confidence, which is this red line, with the trend in trade. Because trade for Asia Pacific is one of the most important activity that firms can actually get involved with. So everything looks really going downward, and everything looks very negative. And the reason why such quick, sudden negative impact on economic prosperity, on jobs, and yeah, on you know, the very pessimistic scenarios or the expectations about future, is that what Asia got very famous for is really growth based on development and expansion of so-called value chains. So what Asian economies, of course, with the center in China, but the others, they are basing their growth for the last 20 years was really through so-called producing for the factory of Asia by putting inputs, raw materials, components, and parts produced within the region, assembling it mostly in China, and then exporting it back to the countries where the demand for such products were, mostly in North America and Europe. This is not to say that the whole of the products were produced in Asia. Actually, the higher value added parts of the product with research and development inputs, marketing, financing, and then after sale services, and also the components that relate to reconditioning and etc. and closing the economy still remain in these other markets where the either you know, research and development prior to the production or the consumption is. But in Asia, what was happening was really the most of the production of that, and the countries got really connected and became interdependent in that connectivity in producing through the value chains for the rest of the world. So when the COVID happened, and when China had in Hubei, when they stopped production, the first sectors that really got impacted were car production and electronics, because these were the sectors that in a significant part were assembled in that province. And then very soon, all the other economies were affected by that stoppage, right? And so we really don't know, you know, if, for example, COVID is sorted out now, tomorrow, and the production comes into place, how long it will actually take for these supply chains to get reestablished. So what we looked at is the piece of literature based on the previous natural disasters that affected supply chain in Asia. And so what you can see is that after the disaster and when things got to normal, it took very long time, almost 4 quarters, for things to actually start to, or longer, to start to go into the normal production mode, right? And so that was even in the circumstances when the policy environment was actually encouraging for a re-establishing the value chains and putting things together, and you know, governments as well as consumers were actually sort of very much in favor of seeing the old normal coming back, or business as usual coming back. Now, what we see nowadays, because of different reasons, is that business as usual, or going back to the normal of what we had prior to COVID, is not going to happen, right? And so one of the reasons for that, of course, because of the supply and demand shocks, people have experienced lots of shortages in some of the sectors, which probably they can more easily live with. But when these shortages started to happen in the sector that needed to provide products and components for the healthcare, like ventilators or the personal protective equipment, or some other parts that are necessary to provide the care in a situation of pandemic, then then governments started to rethink, and also the consumers and producers part of those supply chains started to very clearly discuss or point to the need to rethink that. Additional reason for that was that actually governments made the whole thing temporarily worse, because during March and April, they started to implement, and this is on the left-hand side of the figure here, they started to implement various sorts of export bans on protective gear, on ventilators, on the components for production of medicine, etc. And then slowly, as they have started to realize that these perhaps are not necessarily being productive and pointing to the solution that they needed, they started to also at the same time put in place lots of measures that facilitating importation and trade of these products, and most related through reduction of tariffs on, say, alcohol, or basically letting people import without necessary documentation that normally was required, but letting them do that in a different way, in a contactless or a paperless format, which was allowed through the emergency importation channels. So this is what basically here in end of April or early May we are facing. The situation is that trade has fallen. Through falling of trade, investment has fallen, because there are always two sides of the same coin. Businesses have lost lots of revenue, are facing, of course, possibilities to go bankrupt, and lots of people got either unemployed or are not paid during this period. So all of these, and these are related to very important SDGs that we were looking for, not only dealing with poverty, but also decent jobs, and of course for the sustainable production and consumption, you need investment to turn the old technology into the new one. So all of these elements are now missing, and the question is, how do we actually then turn back to delivering sustainable development once the pandemic is under control, and we can actually then focus on building back or on the recovery. And so the challenges in that, there are many challenges, right? Now, obviously, the first one is that we still don't know what's going to happen with pandemic, whether we will have second, third wave, etc. We don't have vaccine, we don't have effective treatment. Everyone is expecting second waves to pop up in all the countries that are opening, and so we really don't know how long this will be lasting, right? But apart from that, right, there are different pockets or different clusters of challenges that are very important. Now, for the governments, right, now on the tail of uncertainties that we had already through the trade war, what governments now face really a realization that, and that came clear through their reactions during the pandemic, lack of trust and confidence in partnership between the governments, right? So while previously in the global economy we had successful cases and at least attempts to coordinate and synchronize the policies that needed to be put in place to be either cyclical or anti-cyclical or whatever in terms of the shock, right? Here, there was very little coordination, almost none. And one of the reasons for that is really lack of trust, which appeared to be only deepening. Now there are traces of good news through the more recent G20 action, but still what we see is really a deep mistrust. And this is not only between the governments, but also that people within the country do not necessarily have confidence in the governments that have to lead them through this crisis, right? The second thing, of course, that is very important is lack of resources. And in Asia, countries have lots of fiscal space, as we call it, at the beginning of this. But what we are now facing is that the return of foreign indebtedness will be coming to some of these countries. Some countries will have to face sovereign insolvencies, etc., etc. So these are definitely some of the problems at the government level. On the private sector level, the businesses are now facing a very great challenge of having to decide how they will start to recover. Will there be an opportunity to actually go back to the supply chain that they belonged in or not? Probably not. And so what then? Do they start to build something anew? Do they have to pick a new sector? Where do they find the resources? Where is the labor that is available, etc.? And also what, from our work with the private sector in Asia Pacific, we often find out that even though private sector may provide very good contribution to the sustainable development delivery, there are no clear channels in how to do that. So if we are talking about how through their activity in the recovery, they will actually help sustainable development, there is no clear path for that. And we are still looking into that, right? For the international organizations, we are very painfully aware that the multilateral systems really lost their shine for many, and their clout has weakened, and so we are facing lots of difficulties in actually trying to get a critical mass in support of the activities that we do. So these are, and this is of course not an exhaustive list of these. So what the governments, what are the options for the governments? As I said, there are some good news through the G20. The most recent ministerial statement of trade and investment ministers, they endorsed the annex of the measures that is very detailed, and that goes from the short term to medium term to long term, which really commits them, or at least talks about a positive language towards commitment about not using further restrictions, or if using restrictions, to make them really aligned with the trading rules that we have had before and adhered to, so that they have to be transparent, proportionate, temporary, and of course as little distortive as possible. Now, in the longer term, what is seriously being discussed is reset of the multilateral trading system. We recently also got the news that the current Director General of the WTO is stepping down in August. This is probably going hand in hand with the realization that the system needs to be revisited, and perhaps whatever has been discussed under the system so far put aside, and looking at what rules actually need to be put in there to be aligned with the sustainable development goals, and how do we actually get the consensus of the members to adopt such rules and then to actually follow them. At the regional level, I think there are various activities that governments are already engaged in. Of course, I'm not going to speak about New Zealand government, which is very active in this and has engaged a number of countries in actually trying to rein these distortive trade policies. But in looking forward, I am aware of the time. I'm gonna go much faster now.
Is waiting for to start his talk because he has to go.
Let me just finish this slide and then I'll give him the.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. So anyway, so basically looking forward, what we need to really boost is this cooperation of countries so that they put in place coordinated policies rather than trying to compete with each other, right? And then of course at the national level they need to mainstream trade and investment into the sustainable development, right? So the slides that I have next actually talk in more detail about what ESCAP can do and how ESCAP helps governments and various other entities in developing these policy measures. I'm not going to go through those, Vijay, as we are struggling with time, but I'm sure that you will be sharing these with the participants, and so if they have any question, they can ask. So very quickly, in summary, we have a very big game changer in terms of this crisis and in terms of how we use trade and investment to set the countries towards the sustainable development. There are various options and they are all possible if there is cooperation and coordination of activities at the country level. So thank you very much, and Tena Koto very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Mia. Sorry for interrupting you.
No problem.
But we can continue the discussion later.
Sure.
It's very interesting and very new topic. For many new ideas were there. Stefanos, floor is to you.
Thank you, Vazani, and thank you, colleagues. So I will attempt to share my screen too. I promise you it's only 3 slides actually, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. So I think you could see probably the screen. So what I would like to do probably in the next 10-20 minutes is to try to share some thoughts on how we can put the environment, with actually biodiversity and climate action, at the epicenter of building back better or from the Covid-19 recovery. There is a lot of news these days, and actually immediately after the shutdown and the lockdown of the economies, we could see a lot of news saying we see birds and fishes reappearing in the natural environment. We are projecting 8% reduction of greenhouse gases emissions this year. And what I was thinking as a person that I come from the environmental party is that I cannot be cheerful with this news, because this is not the kind of environmental recovery and mitigation we want. We don't want to do good on climate action because our economy has stopped. We don't want to do good on biodiversity because our economy has stopped. We're going to do good in all of them because we need to ensure that we promote sustainable development. So let me start by, first of all, outlining a little bit where we stand in Asia Pacific when it comes to some important environmental and climate indicators, because I want to outline the fact that we do face simply the problem. So in our region, we consume more than 50% of natural resources, and we produce about 1/3 of the global economic activity. So more or less, this is close to what Ned said.
Stefanos,
Yes.
Stefanos, we hardly hear you. Could you just check your mic? Yep. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So also the region is responsible for more than half of the greenhouse gases emissions. And in our region, more than 60% of the global deaths from air pollution is occurring. And when it comes to some specific biodiversity indicators, we have lost already 60% of our coastal mangroves, with a projection that if we will continue with the same business as usual, by 2030 we would have lost 80% of them. And we have a huge amount of solid waste that it's leaked improperly every year, about 90% of our solid waste. So one question I had is, can we actually put health as the entry point to getting back better? And the answer is obviously yes, because that was a health crisis, but I would like to focus on what we call here planetary health. So I think that one of the most important ways to build back better for the environment and biodiversity is by focusing on the concept of planetary health. The planetary health concept is something started about a decade ago after a joint commission of the Lancet and the Rockefeller Foundation, which they talked about the planetary health, and they described the planetary health as actually the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems, so the ecosystems on which this health depends. So planetary health is nothing more than the combined health of human well-beings and of the ecosystem. So, of course, the humans are parts of the ecosystem. And I liked very much the first slide of Professor Karacaoglu, because he showed the SDGs in this kind of birthday cake, where at the bottom layer you have the environmental SDGs. So indeed, we depend on nature for our economic and social activities. But it seems we have forgotten this. So if we want to go forward with this idea of planetary health, that it will save human beings and ecosystems, we need first and foremost to re-establish this symbiotic relation between the humans and the ecosystem. So to make the humans part of the ecosystem, not only in theory, because anyone that has done a 101 on biology knows that humans are parts of the ecosystem, but to make them actually behave as part of the ecosystem. And there are a couple of ways to do this. Actually, there's a dozen of ways, but I would like to, when it comes to specific measures for biodiversity, I would like to focus on two of them. One is we need to stop the harmful environmental practices and the subsidies that they will still support them. I'm talking about the burning of fossil fuels, that it should be taken end. I want to make reference to what the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, said a couple of weeks ago in the Petersburg Climate Dialogue. He said that you need to stop subsidies on fossil fuels. And his language was very clear. He didn't say we need to rationalize. He didn't say we need to reduce. He said we need to stop subsidies on fossil fuels. He also said that we need to put an environment tax, a carbon tax. And he was quite also clear about what this tax should be. But it's not only the subsidies on the fossil fuels. It's the subsidies on other unsustainable and illegal, I would say, activities. For example, illegal fishing and overfishing. Subsidies that they actually not only destroy the natural environment, but they destroy small artisanal fishermen, small farmers, and small and medium enterprises that depends on fisheries just for the benefit of the few. Another area that I would like to highlight as a potential area that we can look when we want to reestablish our relation with nature and build back better is that we need to start taking nature into account. And I know that the first of what it comes to mind to someone that it's an academic or it's an economist, when we say taking nature into account, they think that, okay, let's start monetizing and let's start put a price behind the environmental goods and services. This is an approach that has been followed for some years by the School of Environmental Economists. But I have a feeling that this is not the right approach. It's not that we need to put prices behind the common good of clean air or the clean water. Or can you put a price behind a human life? Can you put a price behind the health of an ecosystem? But what you need to do is, anytime that we are doing budgets, anytime we are doing investment plans, anytime we do cost-benefit analysis, we need to start from the physical capacity of the ecosystems, what we call in biology the carrying capacity of this ecosystem, how much economy an ecosystem could afford without being compromised to frame our finance policies. So we need to look at what are the limits that the ecosystems pose. This is going back to even the 70s. It's not something new. The Club of Rome talked about the limits of growth on the basis of the capacity of the ecosystems. I think we need to see them very seriously, because it's this capacity of the ecosystems that it will ensure the future of economic activities and the future of social life. And if this reestablishment of the symbiotic relation with nature and stopping the harmful environmental subsidies is one of the measures to go through a building back better, what we can do actually to start drawing some lessons from this very big disaster to address another big disaster that is happening, the disaster of climate change. So I want to share with you what I will call 7 lessons that they are, I think we can take from the current crisis and apply them when we design policies for climate action. The first lesson is what I would say, that put science and scientists first. We saw with the COVID crisis that scientists didn't stop on political difference or even on differences that their countries they have. And they united, they share information, they came up with ideas that they accelerated both the response, but also they accelerated the research for medicines and vaccines to tackle the COVID. We see sometimes, unfortunately, that we have in the climate arena some policy disturbances on the science. Of course, the climate problem will be solved. It's solved. It is addressed already, and it should be continued to address via the international multilateral negotiations that under the platform that the UN is providing. But in these negotiations, there's one thing that it's not negotiable, and this is science. So science is very clear. The climate catastrophe is man-made, and we need to accept it. A second lesson is that I think we need to adopt something, I call it a whatever money it takes approach. We saw with the COVID that governments put a lot of money to support small and medium enterprises, to support access to health and other welfare service for the citizens. And that was absolutely the right thing to do. And this is what we should do with the climate also. We should put as money it takes to climate resilient investments. The third is we need to protect and improve common goods. So you saw that countries that they have invested before on the common goods of health and social protection, they have done better. So let's invest on the common goods of clean air, clean water, and climate resiliency so we can do better. A fourth is that I think we need to focus on those that they are usually or already left behind. In the case of COVID, we saw that these were the people living in nursery houses or people not having access to social services. In the case of climate, we're talking about poor farmers, we're talking about people living in slums, we're talking about migrant climates that we need to put at the center of our efforts on building back better. Another is to make the global value chains climate resilient. Mia made a specific reference to the global value chains. I will not make another one, but I will say that we have proof that when we put money to make value chains more resilient, we take this money back multiple times more. So I know, for example, that when it comes to infrastructure, every dollar that it's invested on climate resilient infrastructure, it gives back $6. So give me another legal investment that gives you 6 times your money, and I will tell you, you find something better. When it comes to the value chains, I want to focus, and this is my 6th proposal, on fixing and making sustainable the food systems. The food systems are responsible for more than 1/3 of greenhouse gases emissions. And it looks also that this current crisis, it came from the bad interaction that we have done in our food systems with nature. So fixing the food systems could be actually the big leverage to fix the entire system. And last but not least, we need to ensure that we have credible information and not fake news that they lead the public discussion on climate action. So we need to make sure that we put a lot of what I would say publicized and science that the common citizen can understand, so we can make every climate denier a climate champion. So thank you very much for giving me the floor and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Stefanos. Very, very, very interesting insights that we learned from you. And also we can see very interactive audience session as well here. Speakers are also directly answering their questions. I would like to start some questions which I have picked from there. Very interesting question I got from the question and answer box. One question is there asking, what is the most important sustainable development goal related to post-COVID activity? Can we pick one SDG as most important aspects at this moment? I would like to go to Professor Girol first to hear your.
Hello, do you hear me? I do not think that's a very good question. I apologize for saying that, because I think the whole purpose of public policy that's focused on well-being is to say which one of these sustainable development goals need to be invested in to get multiple benefits. And I believe that, as I said in my presentation, an integrated economic thing, which is investing in long-term projects which are environmental friendly but also generate sustainable employment, together would probably hit most of those, supported by a leave no one behind strategy. In other words, ensure that everyone has bread and income and housing and education. So I would go that way rather than picking one, because I don't think you can model any way which says one will have those multiple benefits. Public policy that's targeted to multiple objectives need to pick a set of interventions that are complementary and have multiple benefits. That's my thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Girol, for that explanation. Yeah, it is integrated approach. Actually, we, rather than looking only to achieve only one goal, we have to look into integrated approach, inclusive approach. I hope anything of other speakers, do you have anything to add to this question? Mia?
Okay, sorry. No, you see the difference between sustainable development goals and millennium development goals is exactly in taking all the goals in an integrated approach and not really singling that we need to deliver poverty and then everything will come out of there, right? So we need to have a very integrated approach, and only that we will deliver sustainable development, right? Not by picking here and there. But if the question was from the perspective of where a possible regression is going to come because countries will not be able to continue investing in these particular goals, right? Then you can come up with, obviously the employment will be at bearing branch. You can pick up any number of goals that look at health, education. In many countries, children don't have access to school, etc. Right? Domestic violence and so many other things that are going wrong with the climate, and so you can really see that there will be, in many countries, there will be regression in these particular targets, right? But as we move forward and we look to the delivery, then we have to really holistically take it forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Need anything? Do you have anything to add?
Oops, sorry. Yeah, what Girol was saying is correct. It's really very hard, I think, to think that there is one SDG or even one target that would be the way that should be the one that we choose to get out of the post-COVID crisis. I really think that the SDGs are something that you have to take as an entity, as a whole, and you have to move them all forward together because they're all so very closely interlinked. I mean, that would be my thought.
Stefanos?
Just to build on what Ned said, we cannot single out an SDG because I don't think that you could find this one single SDG that is not affected or could not be affected by the COVID-19. All aspects of life, economic, social, environmental, have been affected. I wanted to say that I understand many times the governments are asking for prioritization, for focus. I don't think they will find a kind of specific advice on prioritization or focus from external viewers. I have seen governments that they are making their own exercises and they say, let's have this entry point. But my very kind suggestion is the moment that you decide that your entry point is the SDG 8 on economy or the SDG 13 on climate action, at that point, see how it's interlinked with the other SDGs, and then you will have a much better approach, I think. Over, and thank you.
Are coming around. I will go for another question for Ned. The question is flows strategies. What is being done to change the demand supply issue where companies oversupply, which leads to demand? I think you have covered that somewhat in your presentation, but I think it's better to give more clarification around that question as well.
I always forget about this mute business. I think I've sort of covered this in the written response I gave, but to be honest with you, I don't think governments have really done much and are not really doing much to control flows, overflows, underflows, but just flows in general. And I think that's because governments haven't really focused yet on the need to control flows. They are still in the process of controlling certain points of the flows, certain negative impacts of the flows, but they haven't really got to the point where they said, we as a country need to bring our flows under control. We're just not at that point yet. So if you want, flows at the moment are primarily still governed by economics. Is this cheap enough for me to push onto the market? Is the price of the product cheap enough for me to buy? So I think we're really still at a very early stage in this idea of controlling flows. And if you want, turning or limiting the entry of material flows into our economies from the environment to protect exactly what Stefanos and Girol are saying, which is our natural capital.
To you as well. Again, another question to you. Our participant is asking about petrochemical or mining. Do you have any examples from industries such as petrochemical or mining? Do you have? I mean, they are talking about, he's thinking about resource efficiency in that perspective, how you link that with mining and petrochemical industry.
Well, here I would actually refer back to what Stefanos said. I think one of the major problems that we have at the moment in terms of, shall we say, a broad concept of efficiency with the petrochemicals, but also the mining industry, is that they receive huge subsidies, which is artificially decreasing the price of those materials. I mean, as a first step, we should get rid of all subsidies on the petrochemicals and on mining in general. And I have to say, it's a very, very complex task. The subsidies that those industries in particular receive are multitudinous and takes very many different forms. And of course, the industries are there to protect the subsidies that they have received. So it's actually politically very difficult to get rid of them. But I think that is really the first thing that we need to, if you want, get the price signals to the market correct from the extractive industries in general. I think also, but I mean, let's start with that. That's already difficult enough. But I think also, further down the road, we should start thinking about putting a true price, taking into account all the environmental impacts of those, the use of those materials, of the materials that come from those extracted materials. We should put a true price on the extraction. And that in a way comes back also to Stefanos' point that we should be having, or the Secretary General said that we should be having a carbon tax, a tax that takes into account the true environmental effects of, in this case, petrochemical industry or carbon industry in general, so that that is reflected in the price of those extracted materials on the markets. Let's start there.
Thank you, Nate, for that very good explaining. And another question again to you and Professor Girol. When building an agile pool of flexible policy resources, what are the areas to be deployed and redeployed to high priority and pressured areas? Who will be the first?
I'll leave the floor to Girol.
I missed the question because you cut out at some stage. I apologize. If Ned heard it, he can start and then I can build on it. Did you hear? What was the question?
No, I didn't hear it either, not that well. I also had a cutout.
If you have a look in the Q&A session down the bottom, the question is written there, but it was simply, when building an agile pool of flexible policy resources, what are the areas to be deployed and redeployed to high priority and pressured areas? And asking Girol and Ned.
Well, the point I made, and I'll repeat very quickly, in terms of the governance machinery for that, you need to make sure that you do separate out the day-to-day management from long-term investments. You need to make sure that the long-term investment agency, and I would call it then a well-being agency rather than infrastructure agency, takes an integrated approach. And as to how we prioritize, which ones do we prioritize, it's partly based on modeling, which of these SDGs and related material will have the biggest bang for the buck. And then also connecting with local wisdom, if it's a social, environmental issue, making sure that governance also involves interaction with the communities, because often they know best, say with water management and related matters. So I would set up the infrastructure that way.
I agree.
Thank you very much. I am struggling to picking up questions, and I can see so many ideas as also coming up, asking another webinar as well. Yeah. So they want to digest more this new information that they got. Anyway, another question, interesting question. What is the best action we should take for biodiversity in the light of this critical situation? Stefanos, I think you can add something there.
Yes, I think, you know, as I'll go back to this idea that we have lost the symbiotic relation between nature, ecosystems, and the man. And I think that if we want to have a quite urgent action, we need to start focusing on the main assets of biodiversity, on the forest, on the oceans, and I think we need a very strong international platform to protecting them. You know, this year was supposed to be the green year, because we were expecting the biodiversity conference of the parties to announce the new post-2020 biodiversity framework. We're expecting the COP26, where all the countries would have come with renewed commitments for climate action. The meetings will not happen this year. The meetings are postponed. But this doesn't mean that our action should be postponed. So I think for biodiversity, the draft framework for the post-2020 biodiversity framework was out there. It was asking specific targets on protected areas, specific targets on investment for biodiversity conservation, specific targets on the capacity of the ecosystems. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We need to look at these proposals and ensure that the governments agree on them and then they implement them. At the same time, for climate, again, the solutions are out there. We know what the targets: reduce to 2030 by 50% our emissions, go to 2050 with climate neutrality. We stick to this. We do them with finance, infrastructure, and I think the recipes more or less are there. The ingredients, at least, are there. Thank you.
Can I just add one? Can I add one very quick point? Sir Partha Dasgupta from the UK was here, who gave a lecture the other day, and he said, in his whole report, which is commissioned on how do you manage biodiversity, he said, although politically incorrect, the biggest threat to biodiversity is population growth. And the second point is the volume and the combination of nature of consumption. Unless you deal with population growth and shift consumption to cleaner products and services, then you cannot deal. He says it's politically incorrect. You cannot impose population growth. So the only lever we have is to educate people and let communities gradually deal with it. And concurrently, what the government can do is to encourage, through the kind of infrastructure investments we are talking about, a shift of production and consumption towards cleaner products. So that would be a fantastic world to start building.
Great. Yep. Agree. And
if I can just follow up on that, because one thing I didn't talk about in my presentation is that there is a whole strand in the dialogue on circular economies that has to do with biological materials, biomass, if you want, and the flows of biomass into and out of our economies. And a strong part of that discussion is how to manage biomass flows so that we also protect our biosystems and our biodiversity. And so I think this kind of links back to what Girol was saying, is that again, one of the ideas of thinking that is going on is how can we be more efficient in the way that I was describing it, not the sort of narrow sense of efficiency. How can we be more efficient in our use of biomass materials so that we protect the natural capital of biodiversity and the biosystems in general, so that our economies can then also flourish. And I have to say, on a personal level, I completely agree with Girol's passing on the message that a key is that we have to control our populations. However we do that, we really have to control our populations.
I quickly move to Mia because I know she has many things to tell. Mia, could you add your views on that for that question?
Sorry, I'm not sure. Are you asking me about biodiversity?
Yes.
Okay, good. No, I would agree with what Professor Girol was saying, right? In general, we need to actually start with the mindset of consumers, right? And since I agree with him that it is very politically difficult to stop growth of population that's very quickly, but maybe we will be more successful in trying to change the behavior in terms of consumption. But you see, this is the two-way street. And so unless you work directly also with the producers in terms of sustainable production, you will not achieve the total goal only by changing the mindset of consumers. So it needs to be head in head, right? And I think we are using too little of taxation policies to change the production behavior. And we should be using that much more aggressively, even on the consumption side.
Yes, Stefan.
If you don't mind, I'm taking the floor again because I saw a very nice comment actually by a participant, Gea Maridati, which actually she has the right name because Gea, is the ancient Greek goddess of the planet. And she's talking about the consumption and about the commercial determinants of health. And she's making a specific reference to a specific company actually, which I don't want to mention. And I think that, but it's a company that is responsible for a lot of junk food. Let me share a personal thing first of all. I was a smoker for many years, and 6 years ago I quit smoking, and I've been helped very much by all this campaign about how bad smoking is doing and the bad to health. Later, I learned from some statistics that junk food kills at least 5 times more people than smoking. But junk food can be freely advertised, and actually junk food is extremely subsidized by governments all over the world. So this participant Gia gave me a very nice idea. Let's start actually by focusing on what we eat, and let's eat more healthily and eliminate junk food, and really consider junk food the way we are considering tobacco and cigarettes. Thank you.
adding that. I'm very much conscious about time, but there are very, very interesting two questions I picked up. This for Professor Girol. Has New Zealand practically implemented new approaches for sustainability or not?
Say it slowly.
Has New Zealand practically implemented new approaches for sustainability or not?
Yeah, I believe that the heart of the well-being approach to public policy is all about sustainability. It talks about intergenerational well-being, and the whole heart of it is there. Whether it has actually done anything towards it, I'm more pessimistic about that. But certainly the conversation has changed, the intent has changed, the focus has changed, which makes me very happy.
Professor, for all of you, another one question, one last question, Wendy. You gave as many actions, but you gave many actions, but do you think the first action plan we should follow in now these days to have quick win?
Yeah, this business of quick wins. Let me start and see what others think. I know that when we were doing cleaner production, we were always, if you want, well, hopefully we always had our eye on the longer term. That what we were trying to do was to bring in mechanisms that would allow a country or SMEs in a particular country to continue over a long period of time to be more efficient and to look for more efficient ways of doing business. But there was also this concept that we needed some quick wins. We needed to do something quickly to persuade people, to persuade the SMEs in this case, that these were programs that were worth pursuing. I mean, I see that argument. I know that people are skeptical. People don't want to change their habits. They ask themselves, well, who are you? And why is it that what you're saying is of any validity to me? And why should it really work? Prove it to me. I mean, I understand all of that. And I certainly know that in the small world that I inhabited of cleaner production, it did seem to be a valid way of going. But when we're talking some of these kind of macro concepts, changing the whole economy, I find it hard to see what could be quick wins, to be honest. This is hard work. It's going to take a long time for it to happen. And my mind is failing me here. And I find it difficult to see what could be quick wins that we could do to promote circular economy, or indeed any of the things that we've been talking about. I don't know what the other speakers think, but I find that hard. I find it hard to see what that could be, quick wins could be in this case.
Thank you, Ned. Is anything to anyone going to add something for that, Stefanos?
Colleagues, I cannot add something right now. I just wanted to say that I must leave in about 3 minutes. I think it's worth to have another session to go through more discussion. I'm not convinced about the quick fixes. I would prefer to have efficient fixes, you know. It took us about 300 years to destroy the planet. We cannot fix it in 3 months, but we can fix it probably in 10 years. In these 10 years, again, I think we know the solutions. And I think it's the time that we can do the smart fixes, quick fixes. I'll go just to one of them, which is the fossil fuel subsidies. So today, the price of oil is really in the lowest possible level of the last 10 years, I think, yes? So this is the time when something is extremely cheap, take the subsidies off, you will not really disturb the market because the market was used on a price of $40 and $50 per barrel, and now it's in $10. So take the subsidies off now, it's a quick fix. And then when the economy will start recovering, the price of the oil will follow a more market-oriented approach, which is not subsidized. So that could be my quick fix if you want. And I'm sorry if you will see me disappearing from the screen.
So it's time to wrap up.
Thanks.
Yes.
Look, I think we've been really privileged to hear the thoughts of 4 leading commentators on a huge challenge that the whole world is facing. I thank Professor Girol Karacaoglu from Victoria University of Wellington for his presentation on the 2030 SDG agenda and reshaping economic governance with the challenges of COVID-19. Ned Clarence-Smith, the former director of the UN Industrial Development Organization, assessed the importance of strengthening sustainable consumption and production strategies to build a material efficient society. And Dr. Mia Mikic from the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific looked at reshaping regional integration, investments and trading to support sustainable development. Dr. Stefanos Fotiou, also from the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, explored getting back better, protecting biodiversity and supporting climate action through economic stimulus. The video of the webinar and resources, such as the panelists' presentations, will be uploaded to the UNAN's website and you will receive an alert when this happens. We encourage you to share with your networks to keep the conversation alive and to engage with decision makers to influence commitments for the sustainable agenda. Thank you all to the speakers for their insightful contributions. Thank you for your attendance and support. And I also thank Waji and Wendy Hart for bringing this webinar to you. I'd like to conclude with a blessing, a karakia whakamutonga. And it goes like this. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atākura, hei tio, hei huka, hei hauhu, ti hei mauriora. And the translation of that is, cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Let the breezes blow over the land. Let the breezes blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come down, and such a frost and a promise and a glorious day sneeze or release the breath of life. That concludes this webinar. Travel safely, and thank you for your attendance. We look forward to seeing you again at some other webinar or UNAN's event shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.